Made possible through support from ARC thrift stores, developmental pathways, Firefly Autism, and the Arc of Aurora. A THINK+change training.
Hello, everyone. It is Jeff, Honey, and Petrie back for another THINK+change / Arc of Aurora training through our vodcast podcast series. This is episode 2 of our series based on IEPs and 504 plans. What are they? How do you navigate them? In episode 1, we talked a little bit about what are these things. We did a general overview. For episode 2, we are talking about, addressing common issues as they pop up, as they arise, what you can do to manage them so that hopefully you're able to meet your needs when they pop up. Sound good, everyone?
It does.
Right. So I want to just start us off around, we talked a little bit about what IEPs and 504s are, but getting a grounding in what the expectations should be if you're ever requesting or needing an IEP or 504. They're pretty similar processes. So ultimately, you want to initially kind of document your child's needs. Make sure you know or you're seeing and are able to clarify issues that are popping up, whether it's access to general education or homework or what have you. Documenting is a good place to start. Once you really feel like this isn't something you can navigate alone, this is something that's going to put your child at a significant disadvantage from his peers, then start doing some exploration. Talk to your child's teacher, principal, anyone in the school that's trusted that is going to have the information around who either the 504 coordinator is, the ADA coordinator, or the special educator is, if you don't already know that person. It's good to then approach that person specifically in writing is probably best practice to ask for an evaluation of your child based on the things that you're seeing and are concerned about. Well, surely you could do it in person or over a phone call. In writing just supports you in having the documentation you need if ever there's a problem. And while we certainly hope as advocates that there aren't problems and that you should be able to have these casual conversations with educators, if ever you're feeling like you didn't get the response you needed or the timeline wasn't accurate or adequate, going back to that written documentation is really all you're going to have. So we certainly suggest putting it in writing. What you could do if you feel like that's like maybe not your style is have a conversation with someone about, gosh, I would like my child to be assessed for perhaps an IEP or a 504. And then just say, I'm going to follow up, just put this in email as a reminder. So then you've been able to have the dialogue you want, and then you're like kind of codifying it with an email that you can use as documentation if ever you need it. Your formal request for, let's say an IEP where you're really thinking, gosh, general education is not really what my child needs at this point. When you make that request, the school actually has only 60 days to initiate that request. That doesn't always mean that all of the evaluations and testing are complete within 60 days, but they should have been initiated. They should be in progress within 60 days. From an advocacy perspective, we don't believe that 60 days is too short of a turnaround. So please know that if you're really needing some extra support for your child, asking the school team to do that within 60 days isn't a wild ask, okay? So keep moving forward, parents, on making sure your child gets what they need. Once those evaluation reports come in, and maybe they've even asked you for extra information from like a physician or a therapist, those sort of things, the team's going to come together and really look at what makes the most sense for this child. They're going to use that information that you've provided from external providers. They're going to use information they collected through the evaluation. They can even come back together and say, we still don't have enough information. We would like to initiate some additional evaluations, or we want to make these conversations happen. And all of that makes sense because really what you want is by the time you sit down to build an IEP that you know your child's eligible for, you want it to be a pretty robust document, especially that first one. That's really what sets the baseline for what your kiddo needs, who they are, their skills, strengths and as well as their challenges and the accommodations they need to address those challenges. So once you've got those plans, you're going to work together. Like Petrie mentioned on episode 1, right, is you look at them often and regularly. People that communicate and interact with your child should have access to them. To be honest, should have read them and understand them. So it's okay as a parent to say, hey, have you gotten access to my child's IEP? Especially if it's someone that you feel like might not have been a part of that planning process, right? It might be the paraprofessional that your child works with regularly, or the bus driver, right? These kind of supports in your child's life that just aren't always your main contact. It's totally okay to ask if they've had access. It's okay to give them access, and it's okay to ask your teacher or the coordinator to make that access happen, right? All of these are ways in which you've got people that are helping and supporting your child to all be really on kind of the same, have the same information. They're all on the same playing field. They all know what your kid needs and are able to then deliver that. The one piece is it's okay to also disagree with what the evaluations say about your kid. And you could disagree for any number of reasons. Either it doesn't accurately reflect your child, or it reflects them in a way that you don't think is like appropriate, and it doesn't actually tell the school team what their needs are. And if you disagree, you can either ask for another one in the school setting, but if you're not real sure that the school setting is providing that like the best evaluation for your child, you can request from the school and the district an independent evaluation. And this is someone outside of the school building, someone that your child does not know, that you don't even know, that really can give an unbiased evaluation of your child. What's best? Who knows? It all depends on your kid, and it all depends on what you think you need for your child. So a really good rule of thumb, if you don't feel like the IEP is meeting their needs, tell your school team. And if you don't feel like you're getting anywhere with that school team, you can always reach out to the ARC or any of the local advocacy organizations to be able to kind of evaluate what's going on and best next steps. So that was a lot, but establishing a plan should be a lot, right? It should include all the details that you need and want for your child to be able to matriculate and access information and certainly move towards their goals. So part of, building definitely an IEP, even though for a 504, you do need to have a qualifying disability. For an IEP, there's a difference between a medical diagnosis of a disability as well as an educational diagnosis of a disability. And all that gets built into an IEP. But Jeff, I'm hoping that you can help us kind of unpack the difference between the two, how they can support each other, and possible hurdles folks might find.
Yeah, so a medical diagnosis is legit. And whatever, you hear from your doctor or whatever they say about your child, that's true in a medical setting. Mm-hmm. And what they're doing though is they're measuring the child's abilities and needs in a clinical setting, not necessarily in an educational setting. Okay. So whereas you could take your medical diagnosis of, most commonly it's autism, to school and say, hey, we have this new autism diagnosis, we'd like an IEP or we need supports because this is new information. Now the school is going to take the information from that report and do their own testing, and you're going to meet with the team and they're going to determine if that autism diagnosis actually has an impact on the student in the educational setting, and not just an impact, a significant impact.
Sure.
So you could have a medical diagnosis of autism and the school might do testing and say, we understand he has autism or she has autism. We understand that, but in the school setting, they are still able to access the general education curriculum and material and learn with typical peers. So if that's the case, a lot of us parents would feel maybe betrayed by the school, or that the school is really not believing the documentation. And that's not necessarily the case. The school has to just make sure it is having an impact in the educational setting. And if you disagree, after having a meeting and they say, we don't see autism in the school environment, Honey had made a reference earlier to an IEE, an individualized, independent educational evaluation.
So many
And
acronyms.
you can go ahead and get that done and
Yeah.
come back to the table of the team and have someone else that checked out if they feel like autism is affecting the child or having an impact in the classroom. Now it can be a very complicated, there's a lot to really look at here. I mean, I know it's like you're seeing a autism diagnosis and then the school's just saying we don't see it, but there's different rules that the school is looking at to see if the student qualifies under that category. And there's a great tool that we're gonna connect you with at the end of this training, and it's by the Colorado Department of Education, and it's called Guidelines for the Educational Evaluation of Autism Spectrum Disorder. Cool. And you can read the guide. It's like 50 pages plus.
Yeah.
But it will really tell you everything you need to know. And I would always recommend, like, going into the meeting, if you read this, you will not be very surprised by the process.
Sure. And so for anyone listening and watching, we'll link that document into the show notes so that you've got access to it. But it sounds like, Jeff, if there's not an educational impact, and even after the process, even if it's a fine and good, conversation with the school team, that perhaps a 504 might be, appropriate for kids that are otherwise accessing general ed. They're doing good, meeting like the typical standards you would expect out of students. But, a medical diagnosis of autism, let's say, could give like the full team some tips and tricks on things that, that child might need based on like, reducing sensory impacts, again, processing speed and the amount of time that they might need to be able to navigate, and even like social supports. Cool. That makes sense. And then, so like, a parent brings in a medical evaluation, and what happens if they're saying it's an intellectual disability, but the school team wants to give it some like disability, educational disability in the IEP that doesn't necessarily match. So like we know that there's kids that have a cognitive disability, but then the category that the school team puts in is like other health impairment, and that doesn't always like, it's not always equivalent to parents. Do you have any tips and tricks around that?
Well, the most important thing about the IEP is that it's built around what the student needs. The label of other health impairment, intellectual disability, autism, that shouldn't really affect what the student's getting, because the IEP is based on their needs. And that's definitely a conversation you can take further. But the primary concern needs to be, are the goals, are the accommodations, and are the services what this child needs to access general education, successfully. So you can focus on some of those labels and categories, but I would definitely talk it over with an advocate and, find the best way to approach, because a lot of damage can be done in sitting across the table and arguing about something like that, when sometimes people forget the whole purpose is just, what does the student need?
Yeah, totally. So it sounds like having like tight goals might be more important than like that one line that talks about the disability type. Yeah. So Petrie, do you have so knowing that goals are really the driver of the IEP and everything else is supporting goal like acquisition, what are some things that families and outside, support should consider when writing goals in an IEP?
Goals, I feel, really are kind of the heart of the IEP, because it's what's helping the student progress through their school career. Sure. So in terms of goals, you want them to be very specific. You want them to be measurable. You want them to be achievable, while at the same time, really setting the bar high so that the students have the opportunity to learn and grow and progress and access their education to the best of their abilities. And so that's always something to kind of be on the lookout for. And if you're ever worried or concerned that these goals just aren't necessarily appropriate, that maybe they seem a little too easy, a a little too, sophomoric, not really pushing your kid, you can always reach out to your art chapter and say, these goals just don't really seem to be moving the needle for my kiddo.
Yeah.
So, always making sure that those goals are pushing to the best of their abilities. And, they will have academic goals, specifically tied to typically literacy and math. But then they'll also have goals around any of the services that they're receiving inside the school. So if they see language provider or OT, PT, any of that, they'll have goals specifically tied to those services. They will also sometimes have what we call maybe self-determination or self-advocacy goals. Not always, and sometimes you kind of really have to push for these because these are skills, as we kind of poked at a little bit in our first episode, that the more these kiddos can hone in their self-advocacy skills through high school and transition, the foundation they have to kind of launch out into the world and be able to advocate for what they need in post-secondary education or a job or in a living situation or even with their IDT teams, even with their parents, they're able to just advocate for themselves more. So having those kinds of goals within the IEP, pretty important.
I would also like to make a good point. You don't have to wait till the annual IEP to revisit a goal.
Yeah.
And if a goal is met before you get there, the teacher or the person measuring the goal should adjust that goal before, you wait till the next round.
Yeah, that is a good point. And we kind of touched on that a little bit in the first episode that, these goals sometimes are achieved at a certain point during the year. And then you don't just check the box and say, well, that one's done. You keep going. You make a new goal, you craft a new milestone that you want kind of based on what that old goal was. Some goals that you can check off a box and say, okay, we've now mastered how to hold a pencil. And now there's a completely new OT goal.
Sure.
It's just all very specifically tied to what those goals are.
Well, and I think what's cool about building really strong goals is it's not just the goals, it's all the objectives that fall under it, right? So it's like self-advocacy would be that's such a broad goal. But I've seen it be super successful with families that are like, I never know what my kid's doing. They're not able to tell me how their day was. That's a really strong skill to learn as an adult and to have the ability to hone in on it through your academics, right? So a lot of it is like, yes, self-advocacy is the goal, but what are the objectives under it that get that kid closer to being able to report when something's up, also report how the day was, and be able to communicate and know the right people to communicate, like find those trusted folks. Right. And then those goals and objectives are monitored, like their progress monitored. So families should expect regular reports back on progress towards those goals. So it's one thing that I think is easy to miss is that, you'll know throughout the year how your child's doing on those goals that are important to their academics and other pieces.
Well, it's just, as the saying goes, it's not the destination, it's the journey. Yeah. And the objectives are really how, the child's, makes the benchmarks to meeting that goal. And oftentimes you'll find that there may not be progress on the goal. The goal itself may not be unreachable. It just may be the way in which those objectives have been crafted. And so sometimes if, a team or a parent is frustrated with not meeting the goal, maybe look more at the objectives really than the goal, because maybe that pathway just isn't appropriate for that student. So that's kind of important to know too.
Yeah. So a lot of it's that intervention strategies too, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's what we all needed to access our education too.
And those can be changed also along the way. It doesn't have to be, well, we spent a whole school year and we didn't make progress. If you're not making progress in a fair amount of time, or the child isn't, then revisit it. you know, you don't want to waste a full year. You can call the team to the table and say, you know, I feel like we've hit a brick wall. What's next? What other things to consider? So that's to know too, that you don't just have to wait and burn a whole year.
Yeah. Well, and even after, you know, that typical school year is over, that IEP team usually gets together and decides whether, you know, what they call ESY or extended school year makes sense for the kid.
Yeah.
And that's goal driven too, right?
It is. It is. Yeah. It's a smaller, you know, it's kind of, you know, a smaller version of the school day, a smaller version, you know, within the summer. But it is tied to continuity for those kids. So, you know, things that they were working on can still be worked on in the ESY process. Data may or may not necessarily be collected at that time, but the IEP still, you know, holds during ESY.
Yeah, and the goal really for ESY is to make sure that kids don't lose some of the skills that they did, you know, and then they also look at what they call predictive factors. You know, if there's an obvious trend that this child has a hard time recovering from long breaks, usually that IEP team will take a hard look at whether ESY to, like Petrie said, talk about continuity of the school year makes sense. The only thing with ESY is really, you know, it's rarely ever in your school building. It's rarely with your special educator. So it's not, it's just important to know as a family that while ESY might make sense for your child, it's gonna look different. And so it's up to you whether, you know, that makes sense for your kiddo, really.
Yeah. And if it's offered, you don't have to take them up on it. Just because your child is eligible doesn't mean you have to do it if it doesn't seem to make sense to you as a parent. It does, then great. And it doesn't also necessarily mean that once a child qualifies, they've got ESY through the rest of their school career. That can come and go, just depending on, like we mentioned, regression and retention. And they typically will do those data collection points after winter break and after spring break to really see if your kiddo qualifies for ESY.
Totally. So we've talked a little bit about the academic goals and then also some of the life skill goals that, you know, we know in the advocacy world that as your kid gets a little bit older in the middle school, high school years, the goals start to shift to more life skills, less academics. Yeah. But just as parents out there, you know, it's okay to continue to ask for academics to be included. Yes, we all want our kiddos to age into adulthood and be as independent as they're able to. But that doesn't mean you have to lose some of those academic goals either. So we've talked about those goals, but Jeff, can you tell us a little bit about like behavior goals, right? Because they're a little bit different.
Well, so a lot of times, if a student has specific behaviors that prevent them from learning or accessing their learning, what's called a BIP or a BIP or a behavior intervention plan is created.
Got it.
And something a lot of people don't know is that can actually exist without an IEP or a 504 plan.
Yeah.
But it needs to be reviewed. When you're reviewing your IEP, you need to go over the BIP plan or the BIP. And also, it doesn't have to last forever. If you get to a point with a BIP where there's success and behavior has been changed, then you can discard the BIP or the BIP. I'm going to use both of those terms because people call it BIP or BIP. Sure. So how's a BIP created? Well, the information is gathered in something called an FBA, which is a functional behavior assessment.
Got it.
And that's rooted really in the theory that behavior is functional, predictable, and changeable. And this is usually, this plan is created by either the IEP team or a behavior support team that's brought in. There's a lot of data collection involved, and you're targeting specific behaviors. And what you're trying to do is figure out the cause of the behavior and then how you can change that behavior into something more desirable or something that can access learning. And the BIP is very important to have because it's going to protect your child from getting suspended or, you know, kicked out of school, because there's a plan in place to help those behaviors. And if the plan's not working, the team has to get back to the table and figure out, they have to readjust the plan.
Sure.
So if the student's not being successful, it's because the BIP is not successful and it might need to be redone. And also behaviors change over time. So a BIP that might have worked before, 3 years later, it might not work because the behaviors are different or a lot of things have changed in that environment.
Totally.
A trend that really disturbs me that I've seen, we call it the come pick your kid up trend. And what's happening is schools are putting it on the parents to take the kid out of school if they're having a difficult day or they can't handle the behaviors. But ideally, the student, they need to be in school. And every time they're getting sent home, they're missing out on part of their education. And we know that kids with IEPs, kids with 504s, kids in special education, they need their minutes in the classroom. So sending them home is not doing them a favor. It's taking them away from their academics and the resources that they need. And it's also feeding into, I don't know about you, but if I didn't want to be in school and I acted up and my mom came and picked me up every day, I'm going to keep acting up. And if that stops happening, I'm going to take it a step higher. And that's a behavior we've seen out of these come pick the kid up. It never fixes itself. It always escalates into worse and worse behaviors. So that's not okay. And that's
and oftentimes from an advocacy perspective, you know, we see those come pick your kid up moments as actually their suspensions, right? And a lot of times parents are like, well, I want to avoid the suspension, obviously, for obvious reasons, right? But like you were saying, Jeff, it doesn't end up doing that child any good when you avoid the processes that are in place because of IDEA.
And it kind of pads the stats of the school. It makes the school look like they're not suspending kids with IEPs.
Well, and it's setting that kiddo up to fail because it's only going to make that kid ramp up, and that's not okay.
Totally.
So, and then I want to talk about something else. It's called a manifestation determination. And this is a process that's required from the laws in IDEA. So if a kid has an IEP and the school wants to expel or suspend the student more than 10 days in a school year, God, I have trouble saying it. Manifestation determination must be called. And that's going to bring the IEP team to the table, the parent. And what's going to happen is if the behaviors are substantially related to their disability, or if the school is failing to implement the IEP correctly, they cannot continue to suspend or expel the student. And that's a great, if you have an advocate, bring the advocate to the meeting. But more often than not, you know, it's going to be either the IEP wasn't followed or the student's disability is causing this behavior. And it's, you know, something needs to happen. The team needs to get back together. Sometimes a BIP is created out of a manifestation determination if there's not one already in place.
Totally. And that's kind of the beauty. And it's weird. It must be weird as a family to hear suspensions are okay, because a number of suspensions lead you to this manifestation discussion. And the manifestation is essentially a reevaluation. Once you determine that, yes, this incident or whatever the behavior is really because of the child's disability, that allows that team to really look at, hey, is this school environment correct for the child? Do we need additional supports? Are the service hours correct, right? So it leads you naturally into, okay, we all want to avoid this. We know that it's unavoidable how we are currently structured. But without that manifestation meeting and without, you know, skilled and strategic either advocates, family members, or just the educators in place, you never get to that point if you keep doing the pick my child up.
Yeah, if you pick the child up, there's no suspensions, and on paper it looks like there's no issues going on. And you know, I've seen good things come out of manifestation determinations. Sometimes there needs to be a change of placement. It's just not the right place. But if you don't have the data to show the school's not supporting the kid, you're never going to get to that situation.
Absolutely. So Petrie, round us out. tell us a little bit about accommodations. We know that you can get those accommodations with an IEP and 504. What are some things we should remember?
So when it comes to accommodations, I think a really important piece of that is communication between school and parents, or home. Because oftentimes either you don't get a lot out of your kiddo just because that's the nature of kids, or maybe your child is more on the nonverbal side and you really want to know what their day looked like, what they did, what they ate, did they have any behaviors, did they engage with peers. So what you can build into with the accommodations, aside from just what your child is receiving in the classroom, are some kind of communication accommodations between home and school. And maybe that looks like back and forth book for those of you out there who have used that in the past. But maybe there's some really specific things that you want to know about throughout your day. There are a lot of kids who also have some medical conditions and maybe information about toileting, how often, maybe they have dietary restrictions. And so was there a birthday party in the classroom? Did my kiddo get a cupcake today? Just things like that may be kind of one-offs, but that are really important that parents know that this was part of my child's day today. So it's really important, I think, to remember and kind of keep that as a key piece of the IEP. And it can look however it needs to look. It can be the back and forth book. It can be a weekly email from all the teachers. It can be, a phone call, a text, whatever is most convenient for the parent to receive that information from. And then again, thinking about other things outside the classrooms, like field trips, if they go to the zoo or a museum, if they have, splash day or field day or those things are in school. Your kiddos also have absolute rights to be at all of those things. And, I know as advocates, I know for sure I've experienced where parents have been told, your child just has too many behaviors and they can't go on the field trip because we don't have enough staff. Nope, not okay. That's not okay. And if you are being told that, reach out to the ARC of Aurora because we can help you with that. They have every right, just like every other peer in their school does, to participate in these activities. It's part of, being out in the world, and it's part of socialization. It's a really important part to their school day. Plus it's fun and they need to have the fun parts too. So, you may have to get a little creative and, kind of think outside the box on some of those things, what accommodations might help them to access that and to be successful in that endeavor. But it's also a really important part of the IEP.
Totally. Well, and planning for it in advance makes a lot of sense.
Right.
Some families are like, no, field trips don't make sense for my kid. Transitions are too hard. That's just not the best use of their time. The school's still required to educate your child. So it's not then you stay home.
Right.
The field trip doesn't make sense. But if field trips do make sense for your kid and you really want them to be a part of it, having that discussion at the beginning of the year, like, would love for so-and-so to attend the field trips that are scheduled. Let's start planning now. So while yes, it's the school team's, responsibility to manage those pieces, it's also all of our in the community's responsibility to make sure that they know it's important to you and your child. Not all parents, like I said, think that that's important to them. So they might not even be considering that, building in accommodations and processes for it. So give people and space and school teams the time and ability to really plan. It always helps. And we know from an advocacy perspective, prevention certainly makes a lot more sense than trying to deal with it after the fact when people are frustrated and not feeling great, right?
Yeah.
So those accommodations in both an IEP and 504 help the individual to kind of traverse the school, traverse their school life, right? And so we just want to recommend to all of our listeners out there that while the accommodations is often a pretty quick process in the IEP where it's like, well, yeah, of course they need that. Take a chance to look at the IEP or a draft of it before you even sit down in that meeting to make sure it really is reflective. It feels like, just at the end and yeah, that's all what we need. And it's often like rarely even gone over. It's cool for you to ask for that team to pause so you can take a look at that. Because those accommodations are really what help your kid get there, right? So,
Yeah.
do we miss anything, you guys?
Well, possibly, but
Probably, right? Because the IEP in 504 world is just one of those systems that's hard to navigate. And especially if you don't have experience doing it often and regularly, things will always take you by surprise. They certainly do still us as professional advocates. So families and listeners out there, if ever you're just curious about what your rights are within the IEP and 504 process, you can always give us a call. Take a look at our phone number or reach out, or even take a look at our website and see if the resources are available for you there. We want to help you get what your kid needs so that they can be most successful in a school environment and beyond. So feel free to reach out to us. And stay tuned for episode 3, where we're going to interview Jackie Phillips, who does some special education law that can tell us a little bit more about. So we've learned about the overview. We've tried these tips and tricks to try to navigate issues. What happens if those aren't sufficient and you do need some additional legal support? So that will be episode 3 coming up next. But thank you for joining the Arc of Aurora's advocacy team, Jeff and Petrie and myself, Hani, for this series in our vodcast podcast trainings. Take care, y'all.
Bye.
THINK+change. Talks, trainings, and tools to help in your work for or with people with intellectual and other developmental disabilities. Learn more at www.thinkchange.training.